August 22, 1849, 4:30 a.m., Venice, Italy. Austrian Artillery Lieutenant Franz Uchatius watched the wind shift, his hand hovering over the release mechanism of what would become history's most controversial weapon. Above him, tethered to the deck of the Austrian warship Volcano, swayed 200 paper balloons, every 23 feet in diameter, each carrying a 30-pound bomb suspended beneath silk netting. The balloons strained against their moorings as dawn broke over the besieged city. Venice, the last holdout of Italian resistance against Austrian occupation, lay 3 miles across the lagoon, just within range of what Austrian military theorists were calling an impossible weapon system. The architect of this aerial armada wasn't a military genius or a strategic mastermind. He was Franz von Uchatius, a 37-year-old artillery officer and amateur scientist who had spent the past year converting meteorological balloons into unmanned bombers because someone had asked him to solve the unsolvable problem of bombarding a city that conventional artillery couldn't reach. What the Venetians watching from their campaniles couldn't know, what even Uchatius himself didn't fully understand, was that those paper spheres represented the birth of aerial warfare, a concept that would kill millions over the next century and fundamentally change how wars would be fought. The balloons weren't sophisticated. They were hot air balloons made from paper filled by burning alcohol-soaked sponges, released by clockwork mechanisms, and guided by nothing more precise than wind direction and prayer. They failed catastrophically. Most drifted off course, several exploded prematurely, and a few landed in Austrian positions. The bombardment of Venice achieved nothing militarily, but it established a precedent that would haunt military ethics for 175 years, that warfare could be conducted from above, that civilians could be targeted from the sky, and that distance could absolve attackers from witnessing the consequences of their actions. This is the story of Franz von Uchatius, the forgotten artillery officer who invented aerial bombing decades before powered flight existed, not through tactical brilliance or engineering genius, but through desperate improvisation applied to a siege that conventional weapons couldn't break. His balloons killed almost nobody, but they created the blueprint for strategic bombing, for terror from the sky, and for the moral compromises that would define warfare from 1849 through Guernica, the Blitz, Dresden, Hiroshima, and every aerial bombardment since. The First Italian War of Independence had reached a stalemate by spring 1849. Venice, led by Republican revolutionary Daniele Manin, had declared independence from Austrian rule in March 1848. For over a year, Venetian forces had resisted Austrian attempts to recapture the city. The geography favored defense. Venice sat in the middle of a lagoon, accessible only by a single causeway that Venetian forces had fortified and could easily defend. Austrian artillery couldn't reach the city from the mainland. Naval bombardment was ineffective against dispersed targets throughout the city. Assault across the lagoon would be suicidal. Field Marshal Joseph Radetzky, commanding Austrian forces in northern Italy, faced a political problem as much as a military one. Vienna demanded Venice's recapture to demonstrate Austrian authority, but conventional siege tactics had failed. The city couldn't be starved into submission. British and French ships were running supplies through the Austrian blockade. Direct assault was impossible. Artillery bombardment from the mainland fell short. The siege had become an embarrassment, demonstrating Austrian military impotence to European observers. Someone in the Austrian Artillery Corps, historical records don't identify who, proposed an unconventional solution. If artillery couldn't reach Venice from the ground, perhaps balloons could deliver explosives from the air. The idea seemed absurd. Balloons were meteorological curiosities, not weapons. But Field Marshal Radetzky, desperate for any option that might break the stalemate, authorized investigation. The assignment went to Franz von Uchatius, a relatively junior officer whose background made him simultaneously overqualified and completely unprepared for what he was being asked to attempt. Born in Theresienfeld, Austria, Uchatius had trained as an artillery officer, but spent most of his career pursuing scientific interests. He had developed improved methods for casting bronze cannon, invented an early projector system that combined magic lantern technology with persistence of vision, and published papers on metallurgy and optics. He was a scientist wearing a military uniform, not a weapons designer. When presented with the balloon bombing proposal in early 1849, Uchatius's response was characteristically analytical. Hot air balloons had existed since the Montgolfier brothers' demonstrations in 1783. They could achieve altitude and carry weight. The challenge was control. Balloons were at the mercy of wind, with no ability to navigate or maintain a consistent altitude. Using them as weapons platforms required solving problems that physicists had declared fundamentally unsolvable: how to aim an unguided projectile carried by unpredictable air currents, how to detonate explosives remotely with 1849 technology, and how to deploy enough balloons to achieve meaningful military effect. Uchatius began experimenting in May 1849. His initial designs were crude but conceptually sophisticated. The balloons would be small, 23 feet in diameter, made from paper reinforced with varnish, capable of lifting approximately 35 pounds, including the bomb, rigging, and ballast. Hot air generation would use alcohol-soaked sponges suspended beneath the balloon in a wire cage. When ignited, the burning alcohol would heat the air inside the envelope, providing lift. The bomb itself would be a modified artillery shell weighing 24 to 30 pounds, suspended beneath the balloon by silk cords. The detonation mechanism was Uchatius's most innovative solution. He couldn't use timed fuses. Balloons traveled at unpredictable speeds depending on the wind. Contact fuses would detonate if the balloon landed, but not if it drifted over the target. His solution was an ingenious clockwork mechanism, a spring-loaded device that would sever the suspension cords after a predetermined time, dropping the bomb from altitude. A secondary percussion fuse would detonate on impact. The timing mechanism could be set before launch based on the estimated flight time to the target. The concept was theoretically sound. The execution would prove nearly impossible. Between May and August 1849, Uchatius conducted dozens of test launches from Austrian positions around Venice. The results were consistently discouraging. Wind direction changed between ground level and altitude, causing balloons to drift off course. Balloons released together would separate due to slight variations in lift and drag. The clockwork mechanisms frequently malfunctioned, either releasing bombs prematurely or failing to release them at all. Hot air generation was inconsistent. Some balloons achieved altitude while others barely cleared the ground. Austrian military observers watching the tests were skeptical. Senior artillery officers argued that the balloon bombs were impractical, that resources would be better spent improving conventional artillery or building boats to assault across the lagoon. The paper balloons looked absurd, delicate spheres that tore easily, caught fire frequently, and seemed to have minds of their own once released. The entire concept violated military doctrine, emphasizing precision and control. Weapons that couldn't be aimed weren't weapons, they were expensive random number generators. But Uchatius persisted, partly because Radetzky continued authorizing the project, partly because the scientific challenge fascinated him. He refined the balloon design, using multiple layers of paper to improve strength. He developed better varnish formulations to reduce flammability and improve weather resistance. He standardized the alcohol-soaked sponge system to provide consistent heat output. Most importantly, he recognized that precision was impossible. The solution was volume. If individual balloons couldn't be aimed accurately, perhaps hundreds of balloons released simultaneously would achieve a statistical effect. Some would reach the target. Enough might cause sufficient damage or psychological impact to influence the siege. By mid-August 1849, Thaddeus had produced approximately 200 operational balloons and received authorization for a bombardment attempt. The plan was straightforward in concept but complex in execution. The balloons would be inflated and prepared aboard Austrian warships positioned in the lagoon as close to Venice as defensive fire permitted. When wind conditions favored movement toward the city, all balloons would be released simultaneously. The clockwork mechanisms would be set to release bombs after a calculated flight time. The mass release would theoretically create a dispersed bombardment across multiple city districts. The Venetian leadership learned about the balloon preparations through intelligence reports in late July. Their response combined mockery and concern. Daniele Manin, the president of the Republic of Venice, publicly dismissed the balloons as Austrian desperation embodied, paper wishes drifting on the wind. But privately, Venetian authorities recognized the psychological threat. The balloons represented something new and unprecedented. Nobody knew how effective they might be. The uncertainty itself was a weapon. August 22, 1849. The first balloon bombardment of Venice. Wind conditions at dawn favored movement toward the city. Thaddeus ordered inflation of all available balloons aboard the Volcano and several support vessels. The process was slow and dangerous. Each balloon required careful inflation, bomb attachment, and clockwork mechanism setting. By 4:30 a.m., approximately 200 balloons were ready for release. The launch was visually spectacular and tactically chaotic. As the sun rose, 200 paper balloons lifted off Austrian ships and began drifting toward Venice. From the city's campanili, Venetian observers watched the aerial armada approach. The sight was unprecedented. Hundreds of spheres rising into the morning sky, each carrying death suspended beneath silk cords. Some balloons caught fire immediately from their alcohol burners and fell into the lagoon. Others drifted sideways as wind currents at altitude differed from surface conditions. Many were separated from the main group, wandering off in directions that threatened neither Venice nor anyone else. Of approximately 200 balloons launched, fewer than 50 reached Venetian airspace. Of those, perhaps 20 successfully released their bombs over the city. Of those 20, several landed in empty squares or canals. A few struck buildings, causing minor structural damage. One killed a cat, documented in contemporary accounts, because it was noteworthy that anything was killed. The bombardment failed as a military operation, but succeeded entirely as psychological warfare. Venetian residents who witnessed the bombardment described a new form of terror, the helplessness of being targeted from the sky. Austrian artillery could be heard before impact, providing seconds of warning. The balloon bombs arrived silently, appearing suddenly overhead with no warning before the clockwork mechanisms released them. The randomness was terrifying. Nobody could predict where bombs would fall. Sheltering was pointless because targets couldn't be identified in advance. The balloons transformed the entire city into a potential impact zone. Austrian observers noted the psychological effect even as they acknowledged the tactical failure. One staff officer's report to Radetzky stated, "The balloon bombardment achieved no meaningful military damage. However, the effect on civilian morale was observable. Venetian residents fled from open areas when balloons appeared. Commerce ceased. Defensive positions were abandoned briefly. The terror inflicted exceeded the physical damage by orders of magnitude." This observation, that psychological impact exceeded physical destruction, would become the foundational principle of strategic bombing doctrine for the next 175 years. The balloon bombardment of Venice established that aerial attacks could influence civilian populations and enemy morale through fear rather than destruction. The lesson wasn't lost on military theorists studying the siege. Uchatius conducted 2 additional balloon bombardments in the following weeks. The second, on August 23, was similarly ineffective. Wind conditions shifted during launch, sending many balloons back toward Austrian positions. Several Austrian soldiers were wounded when balloons drifted over their own lines and released bombs. The third attempt, scheduled for early September, was canceled when balloon production couldn't keep pace with the previous launch's consumption. Paper balloon manufacture was labor-intensive. Each balloon required hours of skilled work. Austrian logistics couldn't sustain mass production. Venice surrendered on August 27, 1849, not because of balloon bombardment, but because the city had exhausted food supplies and the Austrian blockade prevented resupply. The surrender terms made no mention of the aerial attacks. Militarily, the balloon bombardment had been irrelevant, but the precedent had been established. Aerial warfare was possible. Cities could be attacked from above. Civilians could be targeted without a ground assault. The implications would take decades to fully manifest. The international reaction to the balloon bombardment was muted because few outside observers understood its significance. British newspapers reported it as a curiosity, Austrian desperation leading to bizarre experiments with paper balloons. French military analysts dismissed it as ineffective and impractical. The general assessment was that Uchatius had demonstrated an interesting technical achievement with no military value. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. Franz von Uchatius continued his military career after the Venice campaign, but his balloon experiments were considered a dead end. He returned to metallurgical research, developing bronze alloys and cannon manufacturing techniques. He never received recognition for inventing aerial bombing. The concept was too new, too strange, and too ineffective in its 1849 incarnation to be taken seriously. When Uchatius died by suicide in 1881, his obituaries focused on his contributions to metallurgy and optics. The balloon bombardment of Venice was footnoted, if mentioned at all. But the concept didn't die with him. Military theorists studying Venice recognized that the balloon attacks had failed not because aerial bombing was impossible, but because 1849 technology was inadequate. Better balloons, better guidance systems, better explosives. These could transform aerial bombardment from curiosity to decisive weapon. The challenge was developing those technologies. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 saw the first significant use of balloons for military purposes since Venice in an inverted role. Balloons didn't deliver explosives, they carried mail and passengers out of besieged Paris. The balloons demonstrated improved technology, sealed hydrogen envelopes rather than hot air, better materials and superior construction. But they were still unguided. Pilots had no control over direction or landing location. Nevertheless, the successful balloon evacuations from Paris proved that aerial vehicles could conduct meaningful military operations. Powered flight transformed everything. The Wright brothers' 1903 success at Kitty Hawk opened possibilities that balloons couldn't achieve: controlled flight, navigation, and return to the starting point. Within a decade, military forces worldwide were experimenting with aircraft. The first aerial bombardment by powered aircraft occurred in 1911 during the Italo-Turkish War, when Italian Lieutenant Giulio Gavotti hand-dropped 4 grenades onto his Ettrick Taube monoplane onto Ottoman positions in Libya. The grenades caused no significant damage, but they demonstrated what Uchatius had established in 1849, that aerial vehicles could deliver explosives against ground targets. World War I saw aerial bombardment evolve from experimental curiosity to standard military practice. German Zeppelin raids against Britain, while militarily ineffective, terrorized civilian populations through the same psychological mechanism Ucatius had observed in Venice, the helplessness of being attacked from the sky without warning or defense. British and French bomber development progressed rapidly, culminating in aircraft capable of carrying thousands of pounds of explosives hundreds of miles. By 1918, strategic bombing doctrine was being formalized that aerial attacks against enemy industrial centers and cities could achieve military objectives without ground invasion. World War II demonstrated the full realization of aerial bombardment concepts first tested in Venice. The Blitz, the firebombing of Dresden, Tokyo's destruction, and finally atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki all descended conceptually from Ucatius's paper balloons. The technology was incomparably more sophisticated. The destructive capacity was millions of times greater. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged, that warfare could be conducted from the sky, that distance could separate attackers from victims, and that psychological terror could be as valuable as physical destruction. Post-war analysis of strategic bombing effectiveness reached contradictory conclusions. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that strategic bombing had been essential to Allied victory, destroying enemy industrial capacity and breaking civilian morale. Revisionist historians argued that bombing diverted resources from more effective ground operations and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians without decisively impacting war outcomes. Both assessments acknowledged that aerial bombardment had fundamentally changed warfare, but disagreed on whether the change was strategically valuable or morally justifiable. The ethical debate over aerial bombardment traces directly to Venice in 1849. Ucatius's balloon bombs were the first weapons deliberately designed to attack cities indiscriminately. Previous bombardments, artillery or naval gunfire, could theoretically target military objectives. Balloons, by their uncontrolled nature, couldn't distinguish between military and civilian targets. The attack on Venice established the precedent that civilian populations could be legitimate targets in warfare. This precedent, once established, proved impossible to reverse. The 1907 Hague Convention attempted to restrict aerial bombardment, prohibiting attacks on undefended cities. The 1923 Hague Rules of Air Warfare, never ratified, tried to define legitimate versus illegitimate aerial targets. The 1949 Geneva Conventions incorporated protections for civilians, but acknowledged that aerial bombardment made an absolute distinction between military and civilian targets increasingly difficult. Modern precision-guided munitions claim to solve this problem, that GPS guidance and laser designation allow surgical strikes against specific targets while minimizing civilian casualties. The claim is partially valid. Modern weapons are incomparably more precise than Ucatius's clockwork-released bombs, but precision doesn't eliminate the fundamental issue that aerial bombardment allows attackers to kill remotely, separated from consequences, viewing targets through screens rather than confronting the human cost of violence directly. The psychological distance that aerial bombardment creates was observed first in Venice. Austrian artillery officers aboard the Volcano launched balloons without seeing where they landed, who they killed, or what destruction they caused. This separation of cause and consequence would be replicated in every subsequent aerial campaign. Bomber crews who never saw the cities they destroyed, drone operators who attacked targets from continents away, strategic planners who calculated acceptable civilian casualties as percentages and statistics rather than human lives. Ucatius himself never commented publicly on the moral implications of his invention. His few surviving letters about the balloon bombardment focus on technical challenges and tactical failures, not ethical concerns. Whether he considered the moral consequences of creating a weapon system specifically designed to attack cities indiscriminately is unknown. His suicide in 1881, attributed to depression and professional disappointment, may have included elements of regret over his military innovations, but no evidence directly links his death to guilt over the balloon bombs. The technological lineage from Eucatius's balloons to modern bombers is direct. The balloon bombs of 1849 led to Zeppelin bombardments in World War I, which informed strategic bombing doctrine between the wars, which evolved into the Allied and Axis bombing campaigns of World War II, which created the nuclear delivery systems of the Cold War, which developed into the precision strike capabilities of modern air forces. Each step represented a technological refinement of Eucatius's fundamental concept that explosives could be delivered from the sky against targets beyond the reach of ground forces. At the Museo Storico Italiano della Guerra in Rovereto, Italy, sits a replication of Eucatius's balloon bomb, a paper sphere 23 feet in diameter with a 30-pound weight suspended beneath it. The exhibit placard describes it as the first aerial bomb in history and notes that the original bombardment of Venice killed almost nobody. Visitors photograph the balloon with amusement, puzzled that something so simple and primitive is historically significant. The disconnect between the balloon's harmless appearance and its revolutionary implications highlights how profoundly warfare changed in the 175 years since Venice. The death ray that Tesla promised never worked. The exotic physics that consumed billions in research funding proved impractical. But the paper balloon wrapped around burning sponges and explosives released by clockwork mechanisms changed warfare permanently. Not through sophisticated science, but through recognizing that altitude provided military advantage, that precision wasn't necessary if terror was the objective, and that warfare could be conducted at a distance without confronting the human cost of violence directly. Franz von Eucatius himself never commented publicly on the moral implications of his invention. His few surviving letters about the balloon bombardment focus on technical challenges and tactical failures, not ethical concerns. Whether he considered the moral consequences of creating a weapon system specifically designed to attack cities indiscriminately is unknown. His suicide in 1881, attributed to depression and professional disappointment, may have included elements of regret over his military innovations, but no evidence directly links his death to guilt over the balloon bombs. The technological lineage from Eucatius's balloons to modern bombers is direct. The balloon bombs of 1849 led to Zeppelin bombardments in World War I, which informed strategic bombing doctrine between the wars, which evolved into the Allied and Axis bombing campaigns of World War II, which created the nuclear delivery systems of the Cold War, which developed into the precision strike capabilities of modern air forces. Each step represented a technological refinement of Eucatius's fundamental concept that explosives could be delivered from the sky against targets beyond the reach of ground forces. The Venetians watched the balloons approach with mockery that turned to terror when bombs began falling. They had no defense, no warning, no way to predict where explosives would land. They were the first civilian population to experience terror from the sky. They wouldn't be the last. From Venice to Guernica, to Dresden, to Tokyo, to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to Baghdad, to Gaza, the pattern repeats. Aircraft appear, bombs fall, civilians die. Attackers remain distant and unseen, separated from the consequences of their actions by altitude and technology. The moral calculus established at Venice. That military necessity justifies terror from the sky, that civilian casualties are acceptable if targets include military objectives, that psychological impact matters more than physical destruction has been repeated in every conflict since. The technology has improved incomparably. The destructive capacity has increased exponentially. But the fundamental ethical compromise remains unchanged, that aerial bombardment treats human beings as statistics, distances attackers from consequences, and normalizes mass killing as military strategy. Ushatius's balloons killed almost nobody. That's the least important fact about them. What matters is that they established precedent, demonstrated possibility, and created the conceptual framework for strategic bombing doctrine. The balloons were primitive, unreliable, and militarily ineffective. They were also the first weapons designed specifically to attack cities from the air, the first system that made precision irrelevant in favor of mass effect, and the first technology that separated cause from consequence by attacking from altitude beyond the vision of attackers. The thunder of modern strategic bombers, the roar of jet engines, the whistle of falling bombs, all these sounds trace their ancestry to the silent drift of paper balloons over Venice on August 22, 1849. Ushatius didn't intend to invent strategic bombing. He was solving an immediate tactical problem: how to bombard a city beyond artillery range. His solution was a desperate improvisation using available technology applied with urgency to an impossible challenge. That his improvisation would create the blueprint for 175 years of aerial warfare wasn't part of his design specification. The revolution came anyway, born from desperation and technical curiosity. The Austrians launched balloons because they couldn't reach Venice any other way. The balloons failed militarily, but succeeded psychologically. The terror they created demonstrated that aerial attack could influence populations through fear rather than destruction. Military theorists absorbed the lesson. When powered flight made controlled aerial bombardment possible, the psychological principles observed at Venice became strategic doctrine. Cities could be attacked from above. Civilians could be targeted. Terror was a weapon. Distance absolved killers from confronting victims. In museums across Europe, reproductions of Ushatius's balloon bombs sit alongside sophisticated modern weapon systems, guided missiles, precision strike aircraft, unmanned drones. The technological evolution is obvious. The conceptual continuity is less apparent, but more important. All these weapons descend from the same insight, that altitude provides advantage, that killing from distance is militarily valuable, and that psychological terror can achieve objectives that physical destruction alone cannot. Franz von Ushatius turned a balloon into the world's first bomber not through military genius, but through practical problem-solving. He was asked to bombard a city beyond artillery range. He used available technology, balloons, explosives, clockwork mechanisms, and improvised a delivery system. The system barely worked. It succeeded anyway, not through military effectiveness, but through establishing the precedent that warfare could be conducted from the sky. The mad scientist wasn't mad. He was practical, methodical, and solved a problem with the tools available to him. That his solution would create the conceptual foundation for strategic bombing was an unintended consequence. That those paper balloons drifting over Venice would lead to Dresden, Hiroshima, and every aerial bombardment since was beyond his knowledge or intention. He built what was needed to solve the problem he'd been given. The rest followed inevitably, tragically, and permanently. August 22, 1849. Paper balloons rise over the Venetian lagoon. Bombs fall randomly across the city. Almost nobody dies. Terror spreads anyway. The precedent is established. Warfare has changed. The sky has become a battlefield. Distance has become a weapon. Civilian populations have become targets. And humanity has taken one more step toward normalizing mass killing as military strategy. The balloons were primitive, ineffective, and absurd. They were also the beginning of everything that came after. The thunder wasn't from engines or explosives, it was the silent drift of paper spheres carrying death across summer skies, the quiet sound of warfare transforming, of moral certainty crumbling, of the future arriving in a form nobody recognized until it was too late to stop. Eustachius built balloons. The balloons became bombers. The bombers became a strategic doctrine, and warfare was never innocent again.